Good morning, everyone from Brisbane. Welcome to the Elevate Digital Academy webinar series. We're really excited that you can join us today. We have an awesome topic for you today titled Navigating Issues and Crisis in a COVID World. And we'll be hosted or co-hosted today by Bosco Anthony and Jose Abad, our Digital Marketing Director and Reputation Manager, respectively, at Elevate Communication. A few items of housekeeping. So if you could please put your mics on mute if you haven't already, and just keep them on mute for the duration of the webinar. Please keep your cameras turned off as they are at the moment during the presentation. If you do have any questions, we encourage you to type them in the chat box. Don't wait till the end, just feel free to jump in and shoot through any questions so we can ask them at the end of the presentation, where Bosco and Jose will be hosting a brief Q&A section. We'll also be posting the webinar video and slide deck on our blog in the near future. So stay tuned, and if there's anything you want to go back to, we'll be posting those for you to reference. So in a disruptive age where the smallest things in any company can easily erupt into a national crisis, isn't it best to be prepared? No company wants the sort of unexpected and unwelcome spotlight that makes the news. We'll be breaking down in 45 minutes how no crisis is too small, how to prepare for the inevitable, and what to do if that crisis does happen. Bosco and Jose, take it away.
Good morning, everybody from Brisbane. Just wanting to make sure that everybody can hear us. And if anyone here is on the call, if you could just give us a quick thumbs up on the chat before we kick into gear so that, we know that you can hear us as well. Perfect. Okay. Awesome. So I'm here with Jose. Jose, welcome.
Good morning, Bosco, and good morning to everybody online.
All right. So we're going to cover a few issues today. We're going to go over crisis, and we're also going to go over some issues management definitions and also understanding how this works. And the key element today is really just to make sure that you are comfortable with the different areas that we cover when it comes to PR, comms, and also marketing. So we're going to start off with telling a little bit about who we are, and also going into the issues and crisis and knowing the differences, how to prepare for the different 4 stages of crisis management. And then we're going to also pepper in some case studies. And then we'll be able to take some Q&A topics as well as we get in. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat box. We're monitoring that as well. And we want to start off with issues versus crisis. And so we just want to start off with the definitions of this, and then we'll get into a case study right away. So Jose, in your experience of being a reputation manager, issues, crisis.
Yes.
Where do you lean towards, and how would you define these 2 elements?
Well, these are often very confused. People confuse an issue and a crisis. Issues is when when you're spotting trouble coming down the road and you have time to prepare for that. A crisis typically hits you out of the blue. It hits you suddenly, and you have very little warning. Now, that doesn't mean an issue can't eventually turn into a crisis if you don't do something about it. So, for example, you may know that you're being sued, that a court date is coming up. You can prepare for that.
Right.
There are certain things that happen in various industries that inevitably may occur. They are issues that you can plan for. Inevitably, when they happen, they can be a crisis, but if you've prepared, you're in a good position to deal with that crisis when it does happen. So really the key thing, I would say, if you want to sum it up in one word, is time.
Right. Now, I would assume that crisis is a different element that really at this point, you're now trying to improvise on how to respond and recover from it, and potentially come up with a better way to build the health of your brand after. Is that correct?
Well, that's right. I mean, with a crisis, you have to respond. You don't have time. You've got to respond with an issue. You've got the time to prepare. Right. You're exactly right. So yeah, it's down to that timing. Do I have time to respond? With a crisis, you have to respond. The issues happen. The crisis is broken. You must respond.
All right, so I wanted to come up with a case study, and this is something that happened just recently. And for my friends tuning in from Canada, you're probably aware of this story as well. But Amazon had recently acquired Whole Foods, and they reversed a poppy ban after angering Canada. And so Whole Foods Market, the grocery chain owned by Amazon, reversed the decision to forbid Canadian staff from wearing poppies to commemorate fallen soldiers. The company ignited a political storm when it told its employees they could not wear the small red flowers, which are a staple to the Canadian way of life. And it being that November 11th being the day that we celebrate the anniversary of the end of World War I, it really created this debacle in Canada, and Amazon realized and Whole Foods realized that they had to make some changes really quickly. For the people reviewing this webinar today, I'm just curious if you would lean towards this being an issues or a crisis. And while you're typing in your answers in the chat, Jose, I'm just curious, when you look at this particular story, what are your thoughts?
Well, there's a classic example of where you've got an issue that turned into a crisis. Right. So certainly, what this is something that you could potentially prepare for. Remembrance Day is coming up. Your staff are going to be wanting to wear poppies. You haven't done your planning. Right. So here's a classic example of being a little tone deaf on what's going on in the community. That is your policy. People are going to want to wear the poppy on their uniform, and it's turned into a full-blown crisis because you failed to anticipate that and plan for that adequately.
Right. So, and I think our friends online are also agreeing with us. They're all saying that this has turned into a crisis, obviously. So the lesson here, guys, is that when we are looking at this from a issues versus crisis lens, we can prepare for issues, but we really can't prevent the crisis once it's happened. And once it's happened, it's all about recovering from that event as well. So we're going to go over some of the best practices that we recommend in our day and age when it comes to not only the PR and communication side, but also from a marketing front and a digital front as well. So I'm just going to throw in a few words and sentences here, and you probably will throw in a few as well. But at the end of the day, it's not the crime, it's the cover up. For me, that's a big one that stands out.
Certainly is.
And media are not the enemy. And obviously we want to focus on actions and bring all the stakeholders with you. Jose, what are some of the things that, speak to you when you look at this chart as well?
Well, we're going to your point. It's not the crime, it's the cover. Often it's what you've done. It's not the actual thing you've done, it's what's resulted. You knew that there was an issue, you didn't do anything about it. There was a safety concern, perhaps. There was an issue, you didn't deal with that, and it subsequently comes out that it wasn't dealt with, or you've said something that you can't back up. So that's certainly very important. Look, facts are important, emotions are powerful. That's another thing to really remember when you are in the teeth of a crisis. It may not just be good enough to just state the facts. Emotions are running very, very high, and you're essentially fighting for your brand's reputation in the court of public opinion. Merely stating facts may not be enough. You've got to pick what the pain is and address that. And you've hurt people. You may have caused damage out there. You need to anticipate that. You need to show that you understand that, rather than just necessarily stating the actual facts of the situation. While they are important, you've got to remember that we live in an emotional time, and that is very important. Speak with one voice and don't speculate. So if you tell them what you know and what you don't know in a crisis situation. This is what's happened. This is what we understand right now. What you don't know, don't speculate on that. Let them know we don't know this just yet, but we'll get back to you as the situation unfolds. And if you say you're going to do that, make sure you do it.
That's right. And I'm just curious, for all our guests from around the world, we've got different people from Canada, from South America as well today, and from the US. If you have any tips or best practices in your experiences managing reputation, we're just curious to hear what your thoughts are. Feel free to throw in your comments in the chat box if there's anything there that we haven't covered as far as the different best practices as well. At Elevate Communication, we work with various brands on helping them manage their reputation as well. And what I've learned is a lot of people use the word prevention, and it's a commonly used word, but the more I hang out with you, Jose, I realize that it's not really prevention, it's preparation.
Preparation and planning.
That is, and planning, that is the key element here to manage you through these navigating, elements that are sometimes tumultuous with your brand. So there's 4 phases that I would say are the critical phases for managing a crisis. And at any given point, you're looking at moving from phase 1 all the way to phase 4 or back. So you want to give us an indication of these 4 phases?
Yeah, so as we've talked about, there are 4 phases of a crisis. So then there's the readiness phase. So that's really probably the most important phase of a crisis. Before you're even faced with a crisis, are you ready? Do you understand what all of the things that could happen to your business, to your brand? What are the risks you face, and be prepared and ready to deal with that? The response phase is obviously you're in the teeth of the crisis. Something has happened, you must respond. Resolution is the period immediately following the crisis, where you are now demonstrating that you've resolved the issue, you're making amends, you're demonstrating to your key stakeholders what's changed. Recovery, that's the final point of a crisis. That's a lot of hard work, and it takes a long time to recover from a crisis, but you can do it. It can be done. And as Bosco said, we've put a line at the bottom, you can see there, pointing in both directions. At any time, you can slip from resolution back to response. Even you're in the recovery phase. Now, for example, there are triggers that you may know are coming up. For example, if there's been an investigation into a particular incident, it may take time for regulatory authorities to hand down the results of those investigations. Mm-hmm. There may be civil action or criminal action brought against your company. There may be a whistleblower who comes forward at some point. It may be the media look at a particular trigger, and you're right back into the response phase. So it's not a linear process. You can, and quite often will during a crisis, go from different stages. Back from stage 4, back to stage 2, from 3 to 2, and back again. Right. So that's something to remember, that it's not just step forward all the time, that there will be times where you'll have triggers, but you can anticipate and plan for those.
And it looks like our visitors have also put it in the chat box as well, that make regular deposits in the PR bank, so that when and if a crisis hits, your people will be with you.
Absolutely.
So that's a great tip as well.
Yep.
You know, that is something that we look forward to as well, is doing good and building on that goodwill bank as well. And we'll cover that as well. So when I got into preparing for this particular webinar, I was under the impression that we were looking at prevention, but as you said, preparation is everything. That's right. But there's really 3 critical elements here to issues planning. And Jose, you've worked in all of these 3 areas working with our clients today. So you've got risk assessment, preparation, and time. Mm-hmm. What stands out for you between these 3 areas?
Well, I guess assessing your risks early. Right. You know, assess your risks across your organization. Now, they will be different depending on what kind of business you're in, the kind of stakeholders that you are beholden to, the people who work for you, the size of your organization. So for example, food manufacturers are going to have a whole different set of risks to not-for-profit organizations versus service organizations versus organizations that may have more subject to regulatory control from government. So there are a whole, and knowing what those risks are, assessing those risks and then grading them. What's the likelihood that something like this can happen? And if it does happen, how damaging is it going to be for us? Look at your worst case scenarios through to your best and plan for those.
Yeah, and I think from a digital perspective, the other thing that we also have to be ready for is the fact that a viral effect goes even faster digitally than ever before. We're living in a world right now where brands have breaking news and viral news even quicker. So having a digital response team and having the ability to respond to issues as they come in a really rapid manner is really key as well. So getting your messaging online and having that aligned with your offline messaging is just as important as well.
Absolutely.
And for all of you that have joined in today, if you can also type in the chat box, what are some of the areas in your industry that you may be prepared for or you may not be prepared for? I'm just curious to know where you are on the side of the fence, whether you feel that your brand is prepared or perhaps your brand may need some love.
And I think to go to someone in the chat said, you know, make those regular deposits in the PR bank. Absolutely. And as you just said, Bosco, when things do crack off online, and you will have your supporters there. Yeah. So that's when your supporters may step up to support you in a particular case, if you've been doing the right thing and you've been bringing those stakeholders along with you and you've been putting the deposit in the PR bank, as someone in the chat said. Absolutely.
So let's talk about the holders that we need to sort of have aligned in this process. And I think for the people today that work with multiple leaders or multiple different divisions as well, this is so critical, because this is where many brands go off.
Well, this is it. So this is your preparation stage.
That's right.
We keep talking about your preparations. First of all, so in addition to identifying those risks, let's have a look. We, identify who are all the stakeholders that you're going to have to keep informed during a crisis. Now, we said before, that can be everyone from your customers, your staff. Do not forget about your own people. Forget your suppliers, the people that, and government, of course. There might be regulatory authorities that you have to, and then what are the communications channels? How are you going to communicate with those stakeholders?
Both online and digital.
Correct, that's right. There may be certain processes that you need to follow. If your business is subject to regulatory control, you may have to report to certain authorities. There may be a process, for example, with data breaches. There may be certain processes that you need to follow. Who are your key spokespeople, and get your messaging right? So this is where you can do some training up front.
That's right.
Media and communications training, and have some of your messaging ready in the event that something may happen. You can anticipate some of this stuff, and obviously you'll need to update it as the real crisis hits you, but you can be prepared so you're not working from the blank slate to start off.
I think my favorite process here is the real-time simulation. And the only reason why I say this is because you recently were involved in going through a simulation of one of our clients.
Yes.
And our managing director, Mel, and you both had to work with the client to prepare for this. And I think there was a big knowledge gap at the start of the simulation in some areas. In some areas, the simulation identified some areas that you guys did really well.
Now, we're all communicators. So anyone that's on this call, I'm assuming most of us, we work in the PR, communications, digital media, marketing space. There's a whole range of other roles out there, from HR to operations to workplace health and safety. Now, during a crisis, all of those parts of your business are going to be kicking into play. Do you know what they're all doing at the same time? So you're managing the communications response. So, for example, if your operations people are responding to an emergency, a real-time emergency on the ground, you need to know who's communicating with them, who's communicating to emergency services. You need to be plugged into all of these sorts of things. So the real-time simulation can really help with that. So, for example, if you're working for a company where you do regular crisis training or preparedness training for workplace health and safety or workplace accidents, make sure your communications team's involved in that.
That's right. So, and for our audiences tuning in today, feel free to type in the chat, which area here do you feel is a concern for your own respective brands as well, whether it's the communication, whether it's the stakeholder alignment, or it could even be the fact that you've never run through a simulation before as well. Now, what we recommend and what we do when we work with clients is really building an issues management toolkit. And this covers digital, media, messaging, frontline, and also advice to different stakeholders within the organization, whether it's suppliers, employers, and even customer advice. Jose, in looking at this from a holistic landscape, how quickly or how far back do we need to start preparing by having this toolkit ready for issues management?
Well, as soon as you can, really. Look, it's any kind of preparation is better than none. So even if you've only been able to prepare for a month, you've at least been able to maybe identify who your key stakeholders are. You've at least been able to identify some of those key messages, and you may have prepped a spokesperson. So you aren't caught flat-footed when you've got to do that. But over time, it can feel like it's an overwhelming thing to do, but you can do this over a period of time. You may spend some time assessing what the risks are, and then looking at training some key stakeholders and getting some key messages. That might be the step one. And then you can move from there. Don't forget your frontline staff, because people are going to be ringing in. Look, we've all got high definition video cameras in our pockets right now, and we can all live stream to the internet. Your factory's on fire and people are streaming it onto the internet right now. That'll be happening, and you need to respond to that. People will be calling your company saying, my husband works there, or my father works there, or my sister's inside. Is she there? Are they safe? How do you communicate that sort of information? So,
and let's even take this a step back. Maybe the scenario here isn't life and death, but maybe you're dealing with a disgruntled employee as well. And a common example that I see is, when we look at the big brand companies in the US and how we hear viral stories where a disgruntled employee manages a social media account, decides today is his last day, and decides to put something that goes viral, but it's inappropriate. And now the brand is in trouble. right? Or better yet, someone has captured a video of someone who's working in the shipping area and they're trashing someone's goods before they deliver it to someone's doorstep because they're disgruntled. Are you ready for that? Do you have the preparation required to handle a crisis in those scenarios as well? These are all the different areas that we recommend you prepare for as a brand, because your brand is your story today.
Well, I think you've just pointed out that's right. So I gave the example of a factory fire, and you've given an example of a delivery business that may see different things. So that's right. Anticipate what those risks are, and are you ready for it?
So we wanted to start off with an example, and in this particular case, we wanted to go with the nonprofit organization sector. So Jose, you've worked in this area as well.
Yes.
What can you tell us about this particular industry, and how have you prepared for?
Exactly. So if we're looking at preparation for not-for-profit organisations, so not-for-profit organisations have a distinct, well, invariably they may be, a lot of not-for-profit organisations may be working with vulnerable communities. They may be supporting people with additional needs. They may be working in sensitive areas. And so you can see how there are a lot of risks that not-for-profit organisations may face. If we look at the recent example of COVID, a lot of not-for-profit organisations may be caring for people who are immune compromised. They may have care communities. They may be providing support in the home. They may be sending their people into people's homes to support them. They may be delivering meals. They might be providing other support. How do you manage all of those risks in COVID? Because you're dealing with people that are vulnerable. So that's one example of how a not-for-profit may need to look at that. You're also responsible for spending public funds. You've also got money that you're raising, fundraising.
That's right.
There's a lot of proprietary issues around all of that.
Insurance is another issue.
Correct. And then there may be issues of, like we've seen in Australia, there's been recent inquiries, royal commissions by the government into the abuse of people in care, abuse of disabled people. There's been aged care facilities that have been the aged care sector has been the subject of a royal commission, and the disability support sector has been currently the subject of a royal commission. So you've got to plan for that. If you're a support organisation providing this kind of support, you'll need to go before the commission, and somebody may come forward with allegations. Are you ready?
Right. So how would you prepare in this area? Is it a bit of the training, the issues toolkit? It's a bit of the simulations? It sounds like everything has to be aligned.
All of the above, I think, is absolutely that. And look, not-for-profits are usually pretty good now. They will have reporting mechanisms internally. We'll know if there's been any incidences or concerns that have been raised. And if you know, for example, you may have to go before something like a royal commission, look through all your incident reporting. What's happened? How did we respond? Did we have to report to the minister? Were organisations like the police or child services or other organisations involved in certain incidences, and prepare for those?
Okay, so we've picked an example for readiness, and I think the next part is, let's just say you are now in a response stage, unfortunately. And we wanted to cover this area, and what are some of the critical areas to focus on when you're dealing with a response team or dealing with a crisis that's happening. So we came up with 3 questions based on our expertise and our experience working here. What is it that you know? What can they do? And what does it mean? Right? And this is all, from what I can see here, this is a lot about information, taking action, and understanding the problem.
Yes.
Jose, who and what handles this scenario when it comes to the response side of things?
Who and what support?
Handles the response. Is it an internal team? Is it the management team? Is it a crisis response team?
It depends on your organisation.
Right.
So some organisations will have response teams that are made up across an organisation that may involve HR, communications, operations, and your executive. So it depends on the size. Look, invariably, you're going to have to get your most senior management involved in what's going on. They are the face of your organisation. They are your key spokesperson.
Right.
So whomever your leader is, make sure that they are good, or people within your organisation who may have specific understanding of, if it's a technical issue or it might be something else, you may have other people that's appropriate, but usually you're going through that one key person. And so, and the other important thing here is, what can they do? So that question is, invariably in a crisis, you may want to use the media and your own stakeholders, tell them what needs to happen next or what can they do. Give some power back to people. People feel very, when they're out of control, give them some control. So what can they do? Ask them to do something. So if it's an emergency situation, you can tell them what they can be doing to stay safe. Or if it's another situation, what can they do to, like in a data breach situation, you can tell them what they can do. So you're giving some power back to your stakeholders.
Right, and we've also got a comment here that says sometimes they believe that a multi-department approach is key. And that's really true, but are those departments speaking to each other? Are those departments aligned with the messaging? Or is one department proactive and another department is reactive, which is usually the case,
if we're all working together, then we can be coordinating so that, for example, our customer service is saying certain things to people, and then we've got our CEO or whomever speaking to the media. We need to make sure that everything is being aligned. We're not saying one thing to one set of stakeholders and something to some other set of stakeholders.
And why is response so important? Well, we're at the age right now where storytelling has evolved digitally and in the media and how we consume information. So how you respond to the ongoing story is so crucial. You're either part of the narrative or the narrative is being told with or without you.
That's right. And I think it goes to that final point. What does it mean? Explain to people. What does this mean? So quite often there's a lot of jargon being used. Look, how many new terms have we all gotten to learn since March?
Yes, since March.
There's a whole bunch of new terms. The R naught, what does that mean? And all the other things that have been associated with the pandemic.
Right.
Explain to people, what does it mean? I think that's very important.
So here's an example, another example or case study that we want to talk about. In this particular case, we're dealing with health and safety. This could be a mining example, a construction company. And let's just say there is an injury, or at this point, unfortunately, let's say there's a fatal injury on the work site.
Accidents happen.
How do we put together a response to address this particular situation?
So this is going back to what we talked about earlier, the response. There will be, your company will be responding at all different levels. There'll be an operational response. So people that are physically there, you might be in a remote site. There might be hazardous chemicals involved. There might be all sorts of things that might be going on. So you've already done your planning. You've already done your crisis simulation. So you know who you're speaking to. You can get that information out quickly. So if you've got a hotline for family members or members of the concerned community, they've just heard that there's been an incident, or they can see something that's happened because they live next door to your facility or they're across the road or whatever. They're calling you wanting to know what's happening. Am I safe? Who was involved? That's very important at that response stage, that if you've already done your planning, you can then provide that information. But equally, if you don't know something at that stage, you say what you do know, stick to that, and then provide those updates as the information becomes available. And you can use all of your channels to do that.
And also, let's take another scenario in this area. What if there's, let's say, an environmental discharge in a construction area, which in Australia is a really big topic of discussion right now. How are you prepared for this online as well? Because the news will break in different channels. And having that key messaging built is just as important. So in those scenarios, how quickly should a team respond and address the certain areas?
Look, really speed is the key.
Right.
But you've got to temper that with what you know and what you don't know. So don't promise things, don't say things that you don't know already, because you'll have a credibility gap if you turn around and say, oh, look, the discharge wasn't that bad. We think it's fine. And as it turns out, a week later, you find out that the discharge, for example, if it was a tailings dam and it broke and there was a local waterway polluted, or for example, something like that might have happened. You've got to be upfront. Okay, we know what's happened, and then you can look at what you're going to do about dealing with that. But also knowing, do you have form in this area? Has this sort of thing happened before? How have you dealt with it? If you don't have good form in this area, that's where you're going to have some trouble going forward. And someone said earlier, build that PR bank. So if you've been a good corporate citizen, you've been doing the right thing all the time, versus a company that perhaps hasn't been, know that up front. So how you deal with it.
All right. So, the next stage, which is just as important, is the resolution path, the path of resolution and what happens next. So let's just say you now have a crisis and you're trying to address it. What are some of the critical areas when it comes to resolution now?
So the resolution, this is the immediately past the crisis.
That's right.
People are safe. We know what's happened. We've got the information. and this is where you're immediately responding. So that's the resolution phases we've got here. So as you can see here, you want to maintain that consistency of your messaging across your organization, what you're going to be doing about it, provide those regular updates. As I kept saying, if you don't know, don't speculate, but provide the updates. So when you've got the information and you confirm that and you said you're going to provide that, you can do that, providing those regular updates. And that links to expectations, managing those expectations. So we know this is currently the subject, for example, it may be the subject of an independent inquiry. Government or regulators may be involved in investigating what happened, and you need to manage those expectations. And in some cases, you may not be ultimately the organisation that gets to report on some of this, but you can anticipate when you know a report may come out with findings for what happened. You can be ready to respond to that. So these are all of the things that can happen. As we talked before, you can go from resolution right back to response because you may have an adverse finding against you.
I think for me, what stands out is the updates as well. And, let's use a real life example. When Melbourne went into lockdown, we basically built a relationship in our television with the Premier of Melbourne at this point, because he was constantly on the news giving updates. And, on the flip side, we also started to hear from the Queensland Premier, where we're looking at all these different political figures, and we were basically getting our updates through the media. And this is what people were looking forward to every evening, to understand the progress of how the different states were handling the pandemic as well. So I think the key part here is the person who's also giving the updates is also part of the brand, because now people associate your brand and your message through that person.
That's right. Yes.
Right. So media training is just as important if you are that spokesperson. And I know that this is a common topic when we're looking at looking for resolution. Jose, when you're thinking about resolution in your past as well, can you think of a brand that you've worked with where you may have had to help them resolve a few areas? How do you tackle that? Is it planning first? Is it bringing the team together? Is it training?
It depends on when you get involved. I've been involved with organisations where we've had plenty of time to plan something.
That's right.
And I've been involved with organisations where I got a phone call and I had to be within 2 hours at a facility because there was going to be a press call done. That's right. And I had 2 hours to get ready for that. So it depends on where you're at that particular time. And that's when you look at what your toolkit is. What have you got to work with? How have I got 2 hours with the spokesperson before he's got to walk out the front gates of this facility and face the media, or not?
That's right. And it's interesting too, because I would say that, preparing for this is great, but when you're in the thick of things, it's also having that ability and game plan to act. And sometimes you're working under pressure, deadlines, timelines, and it's about trying to stay calm in the chaos of things as well.
Certainly. Yeah. Can your spokesperson keep their head? Look, don't see the media as the enemy. They're an opportunity for you to provide your messaging and keep your stakeholders informed.
All right. So we've gone through 3 of the stages, and let's just say now we're in recovery mode. And the question is how to repair your brand image. And for the people who are listening in on the calls today, if you can think of a brand that's had some issues with the media or has had to recover, feel free to throw in your comments as well in this particular area. But Jose, you're in the recovery stage now. We have 5 critical areas that we talked about on how you could potentially recover your brand.
Yes.
Goodwill, public relations, storytelling, brand presence, and change.
Change, that's right.
What are your thoughts on these 5 elements, and which one should we pay attention to the most?
Look, they're all good. This is long-term. This is, depending on the severity and of how many people have been affected. Have you affected a lot of people in a terrible way, or have you affected a small group of people? Look, there's a whole continuum on all of this, but really the key to the long-term recovery of your brand, I think, is change.
Right.
What is it? Is it change? Have you changed your ways? Have you updated what you're doing, or is it business as usual? So, for example, you might say, this is unacceptable behavior. We might have uncovered something internally. The example you gave of people interfering with deliveries or being caught on camera doing things that they shouldn't do. And that's unacceptable behavior now, or whatever the culture of your organization is, and that needs to be updated. Now, 12 months on, are you demonstrating that change? Have you changed, or do you just go back to the way you've always done things? The crisis is over, we can just get on with business.
That's right.
That I think is people in today's world, you'll be found out. There is total transparency across everything, internally and externally, what's going on. So I think really that all of the other things are very important. The goodwill that you've built, the PR opportunities that you're engaging in, those great stories, you're building that brand parents. But if you haven't changed, if you haven't haven't done what you said you're going to do, if you just go back to business as usual, none of that's going to work.
Yeah. And I think, when we looked at the Whole Foods example, this is a great opportunity for that brand and Amazon to repair the relationship that they've had with the Canadian community as well. And, I really want to appreciate our guests today who are also throwing in a couple of examples here. And, an example of preparing for a scenario, the royal family planned for the Queen's mother's death in advance. And then they used that plan when Diana passed away. And that's an example that someone has just shared here. Another one was the city of New York had anticipated a 9/11-like possibility and then developed the potential communication response in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So these are examples of how cities and organizations have prepped for one area and then they've had to diversify those plans for something else as well.
But certainly with regards to something like a 9/11, a catastrophic event like that, how could you ever plan for something like that? Who would have ever thought that something like that could happen? But certainly knowing who your key stakeholders were, the leadership that I think the mayor of New York provided during that time.
That's right.
The updates, that sense of certainty. What can we do about this?
Right.
That I think was perhaps some of the keys to what happened there.
Right. I'm going to throw in one more case study and then we're going to jump into Q&A as well.
Okay.
So in this particular case, we're dealing with the food recall scenario. And you've worked with brands in the past as well in this particular scenario. Tell me a little bit about your experience when it came to food recall.
Well, food recall is interesting because you have a requirement. Obviously, you're dealing with public health and safety here. There are requirements when you do need to make product and food recalls. There's a certain process that you've got to go through with food standards agencies. You've got to advertise all of that, and you could just do all of that and nothing else.
Right.
But I've dealt with organizations that have done just that and nothing else.
Right.
Through to other organizations that really make, depending on how high profile it is. I've had cases where there's been product tampering.
Right.
We've seen that in the press where there's product tampering and you're looking at what's happened there, having to make that recall. But what's interesting then is you want to show during that recovery phase or during that other phase is that after you've resolved the issue, you want to make people feel safe to consuming your product.
That's right.
Is it a case of we've recalled something because there may be a danger, or have you actually poisoned people?
That's right.
And how are you going to demonstrate that your product is now safe?
Right.
So that's happened with pharmaceuticals, it's happened with foods. And that is a long-term process. But if you do that well, you can certainly have people who are already champions of your product, show them what's happened. For example, in product tampering cases, what are you doing to ensure the safety of the product and of your consumers?
Right. So you've talked about transparency, trust, and time.
Time? Well, look, yes, for example, in the case of tampering with food products, it may take some time to alter your work processes, the way things work in your factory, for example. Right. There may be covers over particular vulnerable areas, so those products can no longer be tampered with.
Right.
And you can show that to your stakeholders. There'll be confidence in your product again.
So the key takeaway here is also building that trust again, and that takes time as well, and being transparent with your communication process as well. So look, we've covered our segment today on the different 4 stages, and this is readiness, response, resolution, and recovery. And we're curious to hear about your questions or basically your insights as well. Before we get into that, we want to thank everybody that joined us today as well. And Jose and I, both our information is on this slide, particularly our phone number and our emails, and we can also find us on LinkedIn. And at Elevate, we really focus on preparation as best as we can. So
Yes.
if you have any brands out there that are in need of preparing for a crisis or struggling through an issues management crisis, we're happy to take your questions both professionally or through our LinkedIn networks, or even through our emails, or giving us a call, and we'd love to have a one-on-one chat with you. We just want to open it up to the different areas here as far as questions are concerned as well for the audience. So I've got one here that says, with large national, international events and a lot of the same information being provided, how do you appear like you aren't just regurgitating other companies' information in your communications? Any keys for individualizing response and communication? That's a really good question. I think it really comes down to storytelling, in my opinion. And I think it really comes down to telling your story as opposed to repurposing what's out there. So most of the time, I would say going back to the values, going back to a brand's purpose and living up to those values is the first key step on your path to recovery. What are some of the other areas that would?
Well, it can also be the tone that you take with some of your communications as well. That brand personality, what's relevant to your community. So, for example, you're talking about a large event. So that, something like Remembrance Day, for example,
that's right.
That's got a very different tone to, say, for example, a large music festival. Right. There's a very different tone that you would take when you're providing information. It's an important time. Right. You're conveying safety information, but your tone is going to be very different if you're planning for a Remembrance Day or March, for example, or some kind of commemoration, be it Anzac Day, which is a national day here in Australia for our international guests, right, versus something like a large music festival for, outdoors. I think some of those are now returning in Australia, or will be shortly. So it's getting that right tone and knowing who your stakeholders are and matching that tone for your audience. That's right.
Another question here. Thoughts on using your online or offline community to distribute key messages during the times of a crisis? I think ambassadors are really important when it comes to the path of recovery as well, and sometimes also for advocacy as well.
Yes.
Because it does help restoring the faith of the community and people that are paying attention to this. Would you agree? And how would you tap into that community?
Well, certainly we've got, and I think someone's even said in the chat there, like increasingly, organizations need to be thinking like publishers. They have got their own channels right now. You've got your own website. You've got those communities online that you've built over time.
So groups.
You may have large LinkedIn profiles,
Twitter feeds, Facebook.
Yeah, for example, and each of those are going to have, and like going back to the example of Remembrance Day versus a music concert, each of those are going to have a different tone that you can take, and you can certainly do that. So I would be encouraging organizations to think of themselves as publishers, that increasingly people are getting their information not just from the media and official sources. They are getting their sources from, like you said, from influencers and other people who are doing things.
That's right.
Online and increasingly yourself.
All right. And then we got another question here. Can you think of any organizations or groups that are exempt from issues?
No,
I don't think anyone is untouchable.
No, I don't think so. Not today. Look, if you're in business,
that's right.
If you're in business and you're providing a good or service, invariably you're touching people's lives. Yeah. You're providing a service. Even if you're a one-man band providing a service, there's still an issue that you could still get sued.
I think I was reading this online the other day where they said even the church is not exempt from a crisis.
Well,
and I think at the end of the day, any industry or any group that is public facing or that has exposure to the media in any format can be covered and needs to be able to protect themselves.
That's right. Online only business as well. We don't deal with people. Well, online only business, you've got all sorts of cybersecurity and other sorts of data management issues to deal with. So I don't think that there is any organization that's exempt. It depends on what your risk profile looks like. There's certainly organizations and businesses that would have a much higher risk profile simply because of who they are or the kinds of services that they're providing. But yeah, I think issues management is important for all organizations.
We've got another question here that says, what are your top 3 tips for proactive reputation management if you could only do 3 things? I think for me, the first one is internal communication with the different departments and the different people. That's just as important.
I'd say, look, assess your risks.
Yeah.
Assess your risks up front.
Yeah.
Look at everything from the very worst case scenario through to, even if it's, the most catastrophic thing that you could think of, look at your risks and look at what are the things that could potentially go wrong. And then you can focus on, okay, the really, really, and then try to grade those according to likelihood and impact on your business. So focus on those things that are more likely to happen and have a very high impact on your business and prepare for those.
Yeah.
That would be the first thing you would do straight up. The second thing is get your little, get that toolkit that we talked about.
Yeah.
Even if you've got a handful of key messages and holding statements ready to go on a range of issues, that's much better when the call comes in and let me tell you folks, you'll always get the call on a weekend or at nighttime. Crises don't hit during business hours.
Crises doesn't have business hours.
No, crises do not hit during business hours.
That's true.
So that means you are going to be ready. You can at least go to that initial plan. We've thought about this. We've got some messaging that we've put aside, and we have a key stakeholder or a key spokesperson perhaps ready to go.
That's
that
right.
You could do that, or you've got people like us ready who could liaise with the media on your behalf.
Awesome. So we're going to stick around for a few more minutes if anyone wants to throw in any more questions. But for all our guests today, we really appreciate you attending and we really appreciate your time as well. We're wishing you a safe holiday period. We've got a few more weeks to Christmas. I've already got my Christmas tree up. Have you got yours?
Not yet. No, I haven't
All
got
right.
my Christmas tree up.
And for those that are on the call, if you have any questions, stick around. If not, we wish you well. And thank you again for joining us. Jose, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. And thank you so much for your questions.